All right. Well, thank you so much for coming out, especially after we drank all the beer last night. Today, I'll be talking about how JavaScript devs can change the way that we build tools and how they already are. And this is probably not news to any of y'all. So my name is Amelia Abreu, and like Charlie graciously introduced me, I live in Portland, Oregon. I'm a design researcher, and I've always been obsessed with categories. I'm a Cuban American from Texas who's lived in the Northwest for most of my adult life. So it's hard sometimes to answer the question, where are you from? Well, I'd like to start out with the point that categories and distinctions matter. And this is probably not news to JS devs. After all, a language without classes requires imposed classifications. So today I'm going to talk about distinction and classification, why these little things matter, share some of my notes and observations from working on development and security tools over the past few years, and make an argument that there's a lot at stake here, and that we can do better, and we need to do better. From a usability standpoint, I always say that usability, like security, is best baked in early on. And as full stack JS reaches more and more momentum, it's more important to think about this. So who am I and why am I talking to you about this? I'm a design researcher, and I'll speak a little bit about how I hate the word user. I would never describe anyone I respected as a user. But the term user experience seems to have stuck to this area. And over the past few years, I've been working more on security and engineering tools. And as a result, I've interviewed a lot of developers and worked with a lot more. And I often find that my relationship to the dev community is a little bit anthropological. And prior to this, I worked on a PhD in human-computer interaction at UW in Seattle. And before that, I was a librarian, and my first career was as a music writer. And when I look back on these various threads, the thing that these all have in common is that they all involve listening to people talk about complex and technical subjects, and this, ongoing interaction with classification and systems. I also want to note that something that has shaped my Weltschung has been that I'm a child of the 1980s Texas hardware boom. My grandfather worked for Texas Instruments, my mother was a mainframe operator, and neither one of these were very glamorous jobs, but it definitely shaped my understanding of how, the pecking order of hardware and software. And obviously, we're living in a much different realm these days. So, first I'm going to talk about distinction. And as Pierre Bourdieu said, taste classifies, and it classifies the classifier. So in the 1970s, this French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, surveyed thousands of folks and found that their interests, their preferences reflected not only their economic status in life, but also their cultural status. So if you like Petula Clark, that puts you at a very middle-brow status. But if you like shopping at the flea market, that puts you in this square of artistic producers and cultural capital. And this is something that I think we can think about in less of a stratified way, but in a way of thinking, okay, the way that we work, the way that our aesthetics, they matter, and they say a lot about us. Bourdieu also mapped this to the foods that folks like to eat, and then Gastronomica magazine in 2015 updated this. So where your homemade pickles come from says a lot about you. So, in the past few years, I've been working a lot on developer tools, and the term developer experience has come about. And I like it okay, because the word user, or as Brenda Laurel says, that demeaning little word user, is not something you would use to describe someone who you respected. I would call, a friend's bad boyfriend, oh, he's a user. So how do we bring more of that sense that we're working with folks to build tools that they can use, tools that they'll integrate into their everyday lives and everyday work, and that as developers we'll be using whatever is at our disposal to build better things for the end user or for someone else down the line. And there's not really a good nomenclature for that. If anyone has any suggestions, feel free to bring them to me after the presentation. So how does one do this? And I find that this is something that is often mysterious. I work a lot with ethnographic interviews, which means I will bring the team that I'm working with into the field to go hang out with the people who will use the products that they're building. And I always say that I'm going to write a book about doing user research that's asking dumb questions over and over. I'll often ask people what seem like very obvious questions and then just listen. And that takes a lot of humility and also patience. But when we do come to users with little expectation and little assumption, that's where we can learn the most about work patterns, about needs, about workarounds. Yesterday's presentation, and it blows my mind, and my mind is blanking because I'm jet lagged, but there was a really great explanation about workarounds in a presentation yesterday that I loved. And for devs, it's often hard to distinguish between what about the users of your product are going to be different than you and your team. And I always like to start with this question, well, what text editor do you use? Because if you're using Emacs, you will have different keyboard shortcuts and different usage patterns than, say, someone using Vim. And this is often an issue when it comes to developer tools, because they often come out of a roll your own solution. I automate something in my job, I share it with my boss, I share it with my team. We say, oh, let's bring this to the greater public. And this onion you see here comes from a framework called cognitive work analysis, which was developed in the 50s to understand how pilots and nuclear power plant operators related to their dashboards and negotiated their work. And I like to call this the Homer Simpson donut, because at the end of the day, we are all Homer Simpson trying to make sense of something that's often complex and not really designed for us. And you can see here, this was using it with Python devs to better understand how they used the tools. So I often work with fairly conventional hardware companies and software companies. And the idea of full stack JS makes them very nervous. It's like, oh, the inmates are running the asylum. And as folks at the Node Foundation like to say, all 500 of Fortune 500 companies are running Node. However, this does this does disrupt some very long-held beliefs about web devs in this very hardware-centric hierarchy of things. And oftentimes when I go into the field and interview JS devs, the way that they work is different than, say, folks working, quote-unquote, closer to the metal. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the differences that I've found. And this is based on qualitative research. I do not have large-scale demographics to support this, but this is something that I would urge you all to think about, is thinking about where can we get to, collecting more demographics about the backgrounds of your fellow JS devs, and quantifying how this is a more diverse and less conventional community than we might have previously ascribed to software or server-side development. And that's the first insight, and it's probably not news to anyone here, is that because there is no one standard way to become a JavaScript developer, oftentimes JS devs will acknowledge this plurality. And oftentimes I'll interview folks who work in teams together, and they'll say, yeah, like, I do things totally different than him. And this is something that I find that JS devs are far more comfortable with than some of their counterparts. And this is a strength. I would argue that this is something that we want to acknowledge and see as a strength. I think it makes for better products, the more diverse user base. And I've also found, and this is something that seems a little bit wishy-washy, but I want you to bear with me. I found that since many JS devs came of age during desktop-centric frameworks, but have since moved into mobile and Internet of Things projects, is that they have a better conception of code living in the wild and living in the physical realm. And I also find that a lot of the JS devs that I interview have interests in the physical realm, whether they're knitters or skateboarders or mountain bikers. And this is something that is seen not as anathemic to making software, but something that's seen as something that complements it. And this is, once again, sort of pushing back on the more immaterial sensibilities of the traditional, neckbeard security developers that I work with. That term is used with respect. And the last and maybe most quantifiable and most important finding that I've made over the past few years is that JS devs, oftentimes coming from front-end work, have a better idea of advocating for the end user. And they often speak with a desire to help others. I was working on an Internet of Things security tool this past year, and one of the devs said to me, I don't want to make an insecure baby surveillance device. And this was very self-aware, I thought. And also very aware of the impact that one's work had in the world. But we're at a crossroads here. Having a desire to help others is not the same as actually helping others. And I find that, notions of advocacy are all well and good, but there's often a conflict about how to actually put those into action. I often say that doing what I do, I often come to the table when things are already on fire. And and my goal in the work that I do is helping y'all to smell the smoke. Because here's the thing, I am very sick of empathy as a corporate buzzword. Empathy to me is Bill Clinton saying, I feel your pain. It's a gratifying thing to dispense of, and it's often rewarding to hear it if someone empathizes with you, but empathy without action is pretty meaningless. So how do we build advocacy? If you haven't run across this zine from the group Indigenous Action, I would really encourage it. And I find that we need to think about our end users and the folks that we work with as accomplices, not allies. We want to be with them while they use the products that we build, and that in order to do that, we need to build trust and consent. No one is going to let us in, no one is going to trust us until we build that trust. And we build that trust by walking alongside them, by acknowledging those diverse viewpoints, and building meaning into our data gathering. Oftentimes when I work on developer products, there's not a really good explanation of who it's actually for. And this is something that I find that JS devs have a very low bullshit meter for. What's the story behind this? Why am I supposed to use it? Why doesn't this doesn't make sense with what I'm doing? Often I worked on an API this past year that was developed by folks working in C, and the way that the calls were formed just didn't match JS syntax at all. I mean, not that there's any rhyme or reason to JS syntax, but that's not my field of expertise. This is something that I find with developer tools is that we need to give a reason for folks to use it. We need to explicate the stories and make a case for it. Because unless, and there are some notable exceptions to this, but unless we make a case for a usable security solution or for an easily implementable security solution, it's not going to happen. And I think that in this community, our diversity is our strength, but we need ways to understand our impact. And I'll repeat my plea to build more data on demographic diversity, build more data on who's deploying JS frameworks at every level of the stack, and how it's different, how workflows are different, and how this makes for a better impact. And I think that this is especially important when our work impacts very vulnerable people. Often in the jargon around the Internet of Things, aging in place is a big buzzword. And if we're going to be building tools for grandmas, for folks who are living with limited mobility and limited economic capacity, we need to be more aware of how our work impacts them. Likewise, as we, did anyone follow the WeVibe class action lawsuit? As we put connected technologies into realms that we would consider to be very private, we need to make sure that we are protecting our users' data. And notions of empathy and notions of advocacy are all well and good, but but the rubber hits the road when we're in this very intimate and necessarily trustworthy place. And this is the argument I always make to my clients. It's that we shouldn't discount even the most generalist or tinkerer devs, because if they cannot grok your security tool, then we're not going to have security. And we need to invest in design and documentation that does accommodate a larger span of users, even when those users are not what we consider to be traditional devs or traditional implementers of security. This is a big task, and I think it's something that will require rebuilding trust, not only amongst folks coming in, but also amongst the long-range users of our product. And at every level of software and hardware development. So what do we do next? Where do we go from here? This will probably be no surprise to you, but I advocate for understanding developer experiences at every step of the process. If you are working on a roll your own tool, put it in front of other people. And do this early and often. IBM did these studies in the early 90s that said that there was a 20-to-1 ROI on early investments in usability, and that ROI number was increased the earlier on in the process. Usability testing is huge, and bringing your users in, making a more participatory stance when developing your tools and their documentation. And I think that organizations as a whole can invest in understanding these differences in values and skill sets. Because ultimately, I hope that we can work from a standpoint of the ethics of care. This is a big project that I've been working on conjointly, but how do we see our work as caring for our users, not just giving them something cool to use? And I think that this is something that we can bring to our work, and that reminds us of how important what we're doing actually is. And lastly, let's work together. I recently started a program called UX Night School, bringing design research tools to developers and designers in the field, and I'd love to work with you. So thanks.